Now, Pennsylvania's wildlife heritage might surprise you. It certainly surprised me when I first began researching it. Here in central Pennsylvania, we did have white-tailed deer, we did have turkey, we had bear, and we still have those things. But some of the species that we no longer have in central Pennsylvania are really amazing. White-tailed deer were common, but so was the elk. And now there are still some elk in northwestern Pennsylvania. However, they are not the original eastern species or subspecies that used to occur here in Pennsylvania. The eastern elk in Pennsylvania was hunted to total extinction here in Pennsylvania. Later in the 20th century, we brought in elk from the western parts of the United States. So the elk was common, certainly on the ridgetops here in Pennsylvania. Also, we did have some moose, especially in the northern tier waters of the North Branch and possibly the West Branch of the Susquehanna. Now, I'm not necessarily confident that moose were ever here in great numbers, but we certainly had some moose here. In fact, some Native American place names still exist today are references to moose. Moosic Mountain, Chinclicamoose, Black Moshannon, Moshannon Creek. These are moose references. Now, looking at the elk, if it just could have hung on a few more years here in Pennsylvania, it might have survived. And I'm referring to the conception of the Pennsylvania Game Commission, which came about in 1895. Before that, there was virtually no regulation of hunting in Pennsylvania, and the elk was wiped out by the 1870s. We did have mountain lion in Pennsylvania. Again, it's disputed when the last Nittany lion or mountain lion, cougar, was killed off. Some evidence suggests that it was in Berks County. Now that might surprise you. Berks County is a southern county, it's agricultural. You might think, well, shouldn't the mountain lion have hung on up into the mountains of northern Pennsylvania? Well, keep in mind several things. In the late 1800s, northern Pennsylvania was in the process of being clear-cut. The logging industry was booming, and much of the habitat of northern Pennsylvania was severely impaired at the time. And then you also must consider the food supply of the cougar. It's a predator. It needed wildlife or some type of animal to survive on. And southern Pennsylvania's farmland provided that livestock that was quite possibly the last remaining food source for the cougar. But under extreme heavy hunting pressure, the cougar too was wiped out of Pennsylvania. Now, some people contend that the cougar is still here. It certainly appears that we do have cougars living in the wilds of Pennsylvania. The question is, are they just someone's pet that was illegally reintroduced and let go into the forest, or is this indeed a wild population? Currently, it certainly looks like the cougars we have in Pennsylvania are nothing more than escaped or illegally released pets. Now, what will become complicated is when these cougars begin to reproduce naturally, then we will have to decide, do we want to continue to support their existence here in Pennsylvania, or do they pose too great of a risk, being that there are now millions of people living in Pennsylvania, and cougars are known, especially in the western states, they are known to attack humans. So only time will tell whether or not we decide to embrace cougars in Pennsylvania, or whether or not we continue to consider them as extinct species and try to keep it that way. Now, the news about Pennsylvania's wildlife isn't all bad. Many of the species that were at one time extinct from Pennsylvania or extirpated have since come back. Beavers are a great example. The beaver was trapped to extinction at one point. However, today beavers are doing quite well in the mountains of Pennsylvania. Another species that was considered extinct in Pennsylvania was the fisher. The name is often misleading. Fishers do not feed on fish. Instead, actually, they are one of the main predators of porcupines. So fishers are actually quite good at keeping porcupine numbers in check. But at one time, the fisher was considered extinct. One of the more interesting species that has since been coming back in Pennsylvania is the river otter. The river otter was trapped to extinction here in Pennsylvania. And under close wildlife management practices here in recent years, the river otters are returning. In addition, in recent years, the health of Pennsylvania's streams and rivers has improved quite a bit compared to years before. And therefore, not only are the river otters coming back to a protected ecosystem, but they're coming back to a healthier ecosystem. So in the next few years, you'll probably see, hopefully, the river otters thrive in numbers. Now, let's investigate a little bit some of the land use practices of Native Americans that would have had a significant impact on the land. Now, not all historians agree on the impact of fire, but one thing is for sure, Native Americans did do some burning on purpose of certain lands. Now, in some cases, they would burn just the small shrubby grasses around a village to try and keep down the high grasses, which would eliminate some of the pests, like ticks and whatnot. However, some historians suggest that forest land was also burned. Now, why would they burn the forest land? Well, that would increase the reemergence of some food species, like the chestnut, like the oak trees, which produced a vast amount of food for both wildlife and for humans. Now, we can't have the misconception that it was simply hunting and trapping that demised a lot of Pennsylvania's wildlife. The ecosystem was changing as well. As Europeans brought agricultural methods into Pennsylvania, a lot of the old-growth forest land was cleared and converted to farm fields. So this had a drastic change on the environment. Areas that used to be thick, dense, old-growth forest were now open fields, more of like a grassland biome. Now, some species adapted quite well to that: white-tailed deer, wild turkey. However, some of the larger mammals, especially things like the wolf, the mountain lion, the elk, the moose, they didn't fare so well with the change. And when you combine that with an overabundance of hunters and over-harvesting and trapping, it was simply a death sentence for some of these wildlife species in Pennsylvania. Beginning in the 1600s and especially into the 1700s, Pennsylvania's forest landscape was changing rapidly. In some places, this deep woodland ecosystem was slowly being replaced by a grassland biome. And that happened for two reasons. One, Native Americans were moving westward in many cases. In other cases, their farms and their villages were simply being abandoned, and they were reverting to a grassland. As that happened, some biologists suggest that grassland species started moving into parts of Pennsylvania. Now again, this would have been small, marginal areas along the rivers and stream bottoms. Which brings us to the subject of buffalo in Pennsylvania. Now, historians do not fully agree on the presence or absence of buffalo in Pennsylvania. It's an argument that's been going on for well over 100 years. Unfortunately, we don't have any hard proof. We don't have any bones or DNA evidence proving that bison were indeed in Pennsylvania. Instead, we do have some first-hand field accounts and diary records, which I'll share with you later. Buffalo have been confirmed to occur in Indiana, Illinois, and even Ohio. Some historians suggest that if they occurred as far east as the Ohio-Pennsylvania border, then it is feasible that they could have worked their way into some of the new grassland areas starting in the 1500s in southwestern Pennsylvania. We did have other grassland species. The prairie chicken is confirmed to have lived in Pennsylvania. In addition, the Massasauga rattlesnake, which we still have in parts of southwestern Pennsylvania, is a grassland species of rattlesnake. Now here is a map. Everywhere you see a dot, there's a buffalo or bison place name. Now that doesn't necessarily prove anything. In fact, most historians agree that there weren't any buffalo east of the Mississippi River until after the 1500s, again, as Native Americans began to move off of their farmland and villages. Let's look at some other anecdotal evidence. Here we have a reference from 1612 of buffalo being seen near present-day Washington, D.C. Now, most buffalo references that are written refer to western Pennsylvania. So here you see a Uniontown, Pennsylvania reference near the southwestern corner of the state, and here another Uniontown reference. This comes from the Pittsburgh area. And lastly, again, the Uniontown area. Now, many people referred to a book written by Mr. Henry W. Shoemaker in 1915. In his book, he claims that there were millions of buffalo in Pennsylvania. Almost all historians agree that this book is purely fiction. As much as it's a fun read, it is not based on fact or science. I think historian Gail Gibson said it best. By 1780, whatever buffalo had been in Pennsylvania had disappeared.